Hello, my name is Jason Brett, and today I'll be delivering my presentation, Apollo, Science or Politics. As we'll discover, it was both. So, some background. Apollo was a U.S. program to put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth, to paraphrase President Kennedy. The program was very successful, resulting in 6 lunar landings, and although its goal was primarily political, it also led to a number of scientific and technological advancements. But why do it? I'll start by saying it wasn't Kennedy's idea, which is a popular misconception. By the late 50s, NASA had already laid out a roadmap for space exploration, and manned lunar landings were part of it. But it was a long-range goal, not expected to be met until the 1970s or even later. President Kennedy entered office in a time of turmoil. Relations with the Soviet Union were poor, and the Cold War seemed to be heating up. He had campaigned on a platform of using space exploration and U.S. aerospace might to eliminate the missile gap. The missile gap is the perception that the USSR had much greater intercontinental ballistic missile capability than the US, and try to reassert US global leadership. But the orbital spaceflight of Yuri Gagarin in April 1961 put Kennedy in an awkward position. At the time, the US had not launched a human into space and wouldn't achieve an orbital flight until the following year. He needed a win, but one that would give the US time to catch up in the space race. So, with input from his advisors and Vice President Johnson, Kennedy selected a manned lunar landing as a tangible target. On 25 May 1961, he made his famous speech to Congress, laying out his goals for space exploration. It was a bold challenge. At the time of his speech, the U.S. had only Alan Shepard's 15-minute suborbital spaceflight, so not a strong track record in space. Like I said before, the U.S. had a roadmap for space exploration already. It just needed to be adapted for the goal of a lunar landing. Mercury was our ticket into manned spaceflight. The 2-person Gemini was used to build core competencies that would be needed for a lunar mission, namely extravehicular activity, also called spacewalks, rendezvous and docking, where 2 ships meet in space and join up, and long-duration spaceflight. Apollo was the actual hardware that would be used for the lunar landings. So what about the Soviet lunar program? They definitely had one, but they had a great deal of difficulty with it, particularly with their N-1 heavy lift rocket, which never made a successful flight. By 1968, and maybe even before that, who knows, there wasn't much information coming out of the Soviet Union at the time. They were pretty much out of the race to the moon. So on this slide, we've got a great picture of Ed White during his famous Gemini 4 spacewalk, and also a picture of the Soviet N-1 space rocket. And on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to set foot on the moon during Apollo 11. This picture kind of brings to mind one of the ironies of that particular mission is that while they were on the surface, Neil had the camera most of the time. So there aren't very many high-quality pictures of the first man on the moon while he was on the moon. In this picture that Neil took, you can see the lunar module Eagle in the distance and then his own shadow in the bottom left there. So with Kennedy's goal met, what to do? NASA had wisely built hardware for several more missions just in case the first attempt failed. It didn't. Armstrong and Aldrin made it to the moon. So since they had all the stuff they needed, it only made sense to use it. But with Kennedy's goal out of the way, they could now focus more on the science. Particularly with the later missions, Apollo 15, 16, and 17, they had upgraded suits, upgraded lunar modules, and also a rover that allowed the astronauts much greater range while they were on the surface. And personally, I think it's just the most American thing ever to drive a car around on the moon. In this picture, this was taken during Apollo 15 by Jim Irwin. It's a picture of Apollo 15 Commander Dave Scott next to the rover, very close to Hadley Rill. So what was the impact of Apollo? From the standpoint of science, we learned an incredible amount about the moon's origin and history. Believe it or not, there was still debate about how the moon originated before Apollo. Most scientists fell into three camps. Some believe the moon came from somewhere else and was captured by the Earth's gravity, which sounds fine, but actually doesn't make any sense. The Earth is just too small to capture something the size of the moon. Some other scientists like the co-accretion theory, where the Earth and the moon formed at the same time from the same material. That was a very popular theory at the time, but it also has some problems. There was a third theory that was not heavily favored at the time, that suggested the moon was formed when the Earth was struck by another large object. The samples brought back from the moon by Apollo astronauts offer strong support for this giant impact theory. As far as technology advancements, the Apollo guidance computer stands out. Another misconception about Apollo is that the astronauts flew the spacecraft, but really the computer did almost all the flying. Just as kind of a way of comparison, the space shuttle which came in the 1980s and we flew through the early 2010s, had 4 computers. Apollo had 1 each in the command module and lunar module. So they had to work, and they did. No Apollo guidance computer ever failed during a flight. The Saturn V rocket was another technological marvel. It was many times the size of any other rocket at the time, and is still the largest rocket ever flown. We also learned a great deal about orbital mechanics. Spaceflight is counterintuitive to pilots. You can't just point the spacecraft where you want to go like in a plane. It just doesn't work like that. So in a way, Apollo made everything we've done in space since, including the International Space Station. The social impact of Apollo is interesting. It's kind of become part of our American legend, something the U.S. has done that no other country has, and it's a defining moment in American and human history. Apollo remains very popular today. Apollo artifacts in flight museums and history museums across the country and around the world is still very popular. That stuff gets a lot of attention. But during its own time, it wasn't actually that popular. People didn't like the cost, and after Apollo 11, most people lost interest. As a matter of fact, by the time that Jim Lovell made his famous Apollo 13 mission, networks were no longer planning to cover the landings live. It also didn't necessarily have the desired cultural effect. We beat the Soviets and demonstrated impressive scientific and engineering prowess in the process, but it didn't cause any countries to instantly renounce communism and switch to democracy overnight. But like I said, it was still an amazing accomplishment and a defining moment in human history. The next couple of slides are my references, but other than that, thank you very much. This concludes the lecture.